Right, I'm going to show you how to colour Wellington using ProMarkers. Now for starters, the paper that I'm using is the Letraset bleed proof marker pad. I've cut my paper down to A6 so that it's a little bit easier to work with. I've got my acrylic block and my Wellington stamp. So I'm going to pop the stamp onto the acrylic block. I'm using a Memento ink pad in Rich Cocoa. Let's get him inked up. Plenty of ink on him, making sure I'm getting every single little bit of him. Oh, I missed a bit. There we go. And there's the stamp. Onto the paper, a good firm press, and off. Right, the ProMarkers that I'm going to be using for Wellington's the main parts of his body is fur. I'm going to be using Sandstone, Warm Grey 3, Warm Grey 2, and Warm Grey 1. And for his feet and his nose, I'm going to be using a little bit of black, henna, walnut and burnt sepia. I'm going to pop those on one side so that they're nice and handy. So starting with the sandstone and using the image that's on the stamp pack as guide, I'm going to start colouring in the sort of the darkest parts of the shading on him. So I'm going to start just underneath his arm and then his other arm that's almost completely in shade, and underneath his nose. I'm not putting much colour on at the moment, I'm just defining the deepest parts of the shade. And on his hand, where there's not much shade there at all, but it would be in shadow because it's almost on the floor, just the tiniest little bit there. And a little bit more at the top of his arm, his foot, and his leg, and his other foot, and then a little bit round the top of his nose where his eyes are, and at the bottom of his face. On his ears I'm just going over the Memento ink just so that it'll blend in nicely with the ProMarkers later. There we go. And then it's on to Warm Grey 3. So I'm going over what I've already done, but then I'm also adding a little bit of extra ink. I'm using a circular motion so I get it all nicely blended in. Go, and again just a little bit on the bottom of his hand. A little bit more on his ears, a little bit more shading in where this hair is on the top of his head. And there we go, and then on to Warm Grey 2. And I'm going to be a lot more generous with this one, again over everything I've already done and quite a bit of it into the actual image. Because this is the second to last layer, I'm going to go around everything that could possibly be in shadow. So just putting a line where his foot's going to be sort of against his body. And I'm also going to put a bit of a line around both his feet. There we go. And on his face. around his ears, And around his nose as well. And on to the warm grey one. I'm going to start with the finer point over everything I've already done and right into his arm. I'm just leaving the very lightest points of him without any ink. At the tops of his nose. You can see I'm being quite quick with the ProMarkers because they blend so well. You can be quite quick with them. You don't need to take your time as much as you do with other methods. And I'm switching on to the big chisel end, still on the warm grey one, and I'm just going over everything. Over those very lightest areas and over the darkest areas, getting everything really well blended in. And the last bit of his nose. And then for his nose, I'm going to start with the black. I'm just going to put a little bit of the black in, just at the bottom of his nose. And then onto the henna. I'm going to go over that black and do some more. And then for his feet, I'm going to do the darkest areas of his feet. Because his feet are very dark, I'm being a lot more generous with this first darkest layer than I was with his body, which is very light. And there we go. And then we're on with the walnut. Again, over what I've already done. And do a little bit extra as well. And over the whole of his nose. Particularly over the black, because there's quite a big difference between the black and the brown, but it's too pale if you don't have that black in there, but we need to go over it and make sure it's really well blended in. And then finally the lightest layer, which is the burnt sienna, and over everything that I've already done. And again with the nose. You need to make sure you get plenty of blending in on that nose. And there we go. Now his eyes can get a little bit lost. So I just take some henna and just the tiniest little dot. Don't do too much on his eyes because then he looks a bit freaky, frankly. And there we go. There's Wellington all finished. He will dry a little bit lighter than that. This is one that I did earlier that's been drying for a little while. So you can see that he does dry a little bit lighter than the one that I've just finished. A lot more like the example in the picture.